we talk a lot about AI execution, but the reality is that when you go to manufacturing or in plants, there's a lot of companies that are a lot behind, right? That are 5, 10 years behind.
Machine Design attends trade shows such as Hannover Messe each year to take the pulse of what's happening in the global industry. This year, there was a clear change in tone. Instead of the usual focus on scale or broad exploratory experimentation that I've seen over the last couple of years, the focus seems to have shifted towards more execution and, dare I say, real-world impact. That extended to things like artificial intelligence. I think in broad strokes, humanoids, we saw many of those. And there was also a spotlight on defense-related manufacturing. So I thought I'd invite someone to talk to us at a more granular level on what we actually saw and whether what I saw correlates with what they saw. I am joined today by Matthieu Kuleczak, Senior Analyst at Interact Analyst, and who is here to help me contextualize some of those themes. Such a pleasure to meet you. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your work at Interact Analysis.
Yes, thanks for having me. So I'm a senior market analyst. I'm in charge of various reports. One of the key tasks I have is forecasting the automation market, and also more broadly, how many factories are in the world, how many warehouses are in the world. And then we spend most of our time deep diving, so asking ourselves how many robots will be deployed in the world, what does that mean in terms of machinery as well, or components in there. And then for that, we attend various trade shows as well.
Great. Now you do this very much from, I guess, an economics point of view. What is the real focus for you?
So there's many different topics. One of the key topics would be to estimate growth rates. So for example, you talked about humanoids, a lot of questions around that. We estimate your growth rates in terms of revenue, in terms of shipments. And then we estimate also a lot of around market sizes. So as I mentioned, we looked at the counterfactories. So we could ask ourselves, there's a lot of new interesting topics like AI agents, different types of robots and so on. So we ask ourselves, where are the big opportunities? Where is there just hype, and where is there actual deployment?
All right, let's get right to it. One of the big themes that you wrote about was industrial AI going from hype to execution. So yes, for me, there's been a lot of AI washing in a lot of the content that we've seen or the literature written. Tell me a little bit about what you experienced this year.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting actually, because so when I look back, especially at Hannover Messe throughout the year, there's always been some kind of circularity or cycles where there's some new technology that comes up. There's a lot of hype around it. I'm thinking about digital twin, or for example, a few years back, predictive maintenance, where it was a big new thing. A lot of people were talking about it, and then it died down. With AI, it's been a bit different. So there's still a lot of real execution happening. Now, I think the key theme this year is that before, there's a lot of companies that had some very nice solutions, a great agent or great new solutions, but they were searching for a problem for those. And it was a bit of an interesting mismatch now. So this is why we wrote in this piece that now it's a bit more the other way around. There's some more real-world problems that found solutions. And there's also a lot more success stories. So companies can talk about deployment at a better scale, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, of course, we saw humanoids everywhere. They are really gaining ground, or am I misunderstanding what we're seeing on the trade show floors versus what is actually happening? Tell me a little bit about the numbers behind it.
Yeah, it's very interesting, to be honest, because so we went to other trade shows like Logimat or Modex, which are much more focused on supply chain logistics, much more straightforward. And the striking difference is that at the other trade shows, there was almost no humanoids. For example, Logimat in Stuttgart, which is very specific for warehousing, there was one or two, but just on display and nothing really real. And I was really surprised then when we came to Hanover that there was so many new humanoids launched and on display. Now it's a bit different as well because there's a lot of brand recognition being built. Now on the other side, when we did a lot of discussions, we realized that the companies that makes the component for humanoids, they see a lot of demand as well. There's really a lot of demand. So we're asking ourselves, where are all these humanoids going? The answer is that there's a lot of them being deployed in China at the moment without so much noise as well. In the meantime, we're still at the very early stage, right? I think when we make our forecasts now, there's not that many, but it's doubling almost every 2 years. And then we're going to get to some better adoption by 2030. Now, we have to make the distinction as well in which type of humanoids and which applications. There's a lot for training. For example, we see use cases in Germany or success stories in Germany, which is mostly training. Now, real world applications are still very low, very early adoption, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that time horizon, as you said, is more towards 2030, 35. What is more realistic where you will see real applications or real examples or use cases on the factory floor?
So to give some perspective, we forecast a bit more than 700,000 units being shipped by 2032. Now, a lot of them, as I said before, will be in China or in different use. What's still interesting as well is that the form factor are changing. We see a lot more humanoids being deployed with wheels, for example, which is much more efficient, and that's still growing. So the difference as well is that when we look at growth rates, we go from nothing to something. So it looks like it's growing a lot, but it's still we still get there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you made an interesting point about the components and supply of components as well. Talk a little bit more about that. I know that one of the interviews I did was with the Schaeffler actuator platform. That's one example. Tell me more about what you saw at Hanover and how that translates into other suppliers of components.
Yes, so it's very interesting there. I think there's a whole ecosystem forming. There's a lot of very interesting opportunities as well. We can talk about battery manufacturers. There's a lot of companies that specialize for forklift or other type of vehicles, and they could quickly adapt their product for humanoids. So we can see demand booming there. Another important point would be on gears and gearing. When we think about precision gearing, there's really a lot more in the bill of material in humanoids, and you need really high precision gearing. So all the companies that make those, there's a few in Italy, Germany, for example, see a lot more demand there. And the other key component is machine vision, which is really important for humanoids, right? And here it's always been a very high growth market, and it's growing even more.
Yeah, and just bring that closer to home now with the geography itself. Which direction is the components going into? You did mention that we're seeing a much greater production in China. Those the components being developed, are they being directed towards China? What is really happening?
That's a very good question. It really depends of the vendors and the manufacturers. And so, for example, Hexagon is based in Europe, but there's also a lot of important vendors like Agility Robotics that are in the US. So then it will depend on the specific supply chain. The thing is that it's so early stage as well, and there's so much uncertainty that many things could shift quickly, right? So for now, it's the traditional component makers, people putting things together. So that's why as well they're still relatively quite expensive when you compare to manual labor. But yeah, so it's becoming more real. That's really the key takeaway.
Okay, let's go now to defense emerging as a key growth vertical. So at Hanover, there were clear signals of rising defense-related manufacturing demand, would you say? And we particularly know that this goes through automation, electronics, and data-centered or data center adjacent infrastructure, particularly in Europe. So tell me a little bit more about the broader themes around this.
Yes, so here it's always more complicated, especially with defense, because by nature things are more secretive. Also, when you think about it, the biggest or the large automation vendors will always be more likely to push different success stories, especially around food and bev or chemical manufacturing. Now, in the meantime, when we had interviews and discussions with vendors, they a lot mentioned that there's a lot of talk around defense in Europe. So it will go throughout the whole supply chain. So, for example, at different trade shows, we talk with people that build the infrastructure for buildings, building management systems, or door manufacturers, and they will tell us that there's some big contracts that could be won there. In the meantime, as you mentioned, data center, it's already a high growth vertical. Now, what's interesting is that there's only that many data center you need. So in the meantime, some of the highest growth might have been passed. Again, this moves so quick that it's often hard to judge. In the meantime, so that could be a new source of growth for data center. And the thing is that the supply chain there, you need a lot of cooling, you need a lot of fans, and there's a lot of large companies, automation vendors based in Europe that are very good at this. So here they really mentioned that defense is a new key growth vertical. They're really, really pushing there. In the meantime, we don't know if it's going to last that long, right? So it could be just a 1 or 2 year thing, not really a long-term trend.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go now to software-defined automation gaining traction with the end state unclear. Oh, unpack this one for me. How do you interpret this shift?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's a bit more technical. It's a topic I've been following for a few years. There's really so the key theme really of software-defined automation is when you think about manufacturing, so factories in general, to put software first, to put the digital element first. It's a very broad concept. What it means more in practice is that there's companies that will make soft or virtual PLCs, which are the components that are used to drive machines or to control machines. And before they used to be actual hardware, right? So normal boxes that had some cost and were more easy to program. And now there's really a shift where there's been innovation and you can do that with the software. It was for a long time still a concept, and there's been some slow adoption. Now this year we saw more success stories. And in the meantime, when we see nice success stories during trade shows, we always have to see that those are companies that are willing to tell us that they deploy and talk to us more in depth. In the meantime, the vendors, they will tell us, yes, we have more companies now interested in that. And they don't want to mention or they prefer to stay anonymous. So then we see more traction. So to go back to the main point, I think it's really a theme around more digitization. When we think about it as well, to put things in perspective, if you think about manufacturing in Europe and in the world, automation is still at its early stage. There's still a lot of manual labor happening. There's still a lot of manual input. And then if you compare that to digitization, there's still a lot of things that could be done much better, right? And much more efficient. So here we are still again at a very early stage here.
Okay, there's just one thing I want you to add to that is talk to me more specifically about what does this mean for the hardware layer?
Yes, so here we could take the example, if you think about it, with cameras. I think about 10, 15 years ago, there was Kodak that had not yet digitized, or it was more, I forgot the exact term, but it was non-digital cameras. And things became digital, and then that meant that a lot of companies went down. So you had the old ways of taking pictures where you would print things. And it was kind of a revolution, but at the beginning, it was very slow adoption. And now we are living the same kind of the same crossroads where you will have some companies that will be much more slow in adoption and are much more reluctant. And in the meantime, that offers a huge potential to not just convert your own adopters on your own market, but also steal market share from other companies, right? So then to summarize, what's really happening is that there is more now willingness to adopt those new types of software-defined automation, and it's really more of a pull from customers rather than a push from vendors that have these new things that are really trying to sell them.
Great. You know, the fourth one that you discuss is the IT/OT convergence remaining a central industry theme. So, you know, for me, integration, that's the big word, the big buzzword everywhere I go. Help me understand IT/OT convergence today.
Yeah, it's also a very interesting topic. Something we could talk about for hours. There's a lot of different sub-elements happening within IT/OT convergence. I think to boil it down, the essence of the story is that OT will be operational technology, things that are much more related to the shop floor. For example, fixing machines, talking with execution systems. And IT is more of, as we talked about with software-defined automation, having IT engineers looking at PLC programming in a different ways. There's different languages. And the convergence is more than now, there's always a topic around what is IT and what is OT. And what it means is when you think about for a plant and managing executions, who's in charge of what? Who's in charge of maintenance? Where does the data goes? How do you translate things? There's a lot of very important topics. And here, what really struck is there's a foundation called the OPC Foundation. It's very technical around data format. And the idea was that they were connecting PLCs, so control systems, from I think 50 plus different vendors all together. And the idea is really to create a common ground for having everything, all the machines talking to themselves in the common language. Because we talk a lot about AI execution, we talk a lot about very nice software things to be done, but the reality is that when you go to manufacturing or in plants, there's a lot of companies that are a lot behind, right? That are 5, 10 years behind because they've got whole hardwares. So really the topic here is to get everyone on the same level and to start, getting some sort of education going on.
That already gives me some hint as to why the fifth trend that you call out is important, but I'll let you explain. This idea that greenfield investment activity is becoming increasingly limited actually surprised me because, with all of the new technologies coming on tap, I would expect the opposite. So help me unpack this one.
Yeah, so it's not really a new trend. It's been going on since I think like 2025. The idea is that when you talk about new factories um, in countries like the US, Germany, or Western Europe, or North America, there's already a lot of factories. Now, in the meantime, we see a lot of investments related to nearshoring, reshoring. There's a lot of announcements about companies building new large plants. The thing is that in reality, those are often expansion of existing plants. In reality, those big companies, they are big manufacturers, that is the biggest. They often have plants in different countries or at least suppliers. And this would be more of a shift. The thing is as well is that when you think about the need for production, let's take, for example, the automotive or chemical industry, even if you think that the market will grow or that shipments will grow next year or the year after that, capacity utilization is still relatively low. I think I was surprised. I was looking in automotive in the US, it was still close to 65, 70%. What it means is that because now things are very uncertain, right? Interest rates are very high. And when we look at the cost of running a factory, it's actually as high as it has ever been. So therefore, getting things wrong, building new plants is a really important investment. Those are 10 years long plan, right? Getting it wrong is as the highest penalty as it has ever gotten. And therefore, there's a lot of companies that are saying we should make the most out of what we already have, even more than before. So that could translate, for example, into adding an extra shift or modernizing machines. So really working on existing plants rather than working on new things, completely new. I think I was asking a lot to vendors, are you actually dealing with completely new factories being built or more with existing factories? And it was really a huge difference from last year. A lot of companies were saying, no, it's existing factories. There's not that many new plants going on at the moment.
Matthieu, I can't thank you enough. That is wonderful. Really great insights. I appreciate it very much. And to wrap things up, what are your final thoughts? Now you've been to Hanover, you've put together your report. What does hindsight tell you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Then, I mean, there's a lot of new different topics that are popping up. As we talked about, software-defined automation is still very much of a concept. There will be probably a lot of announcements related to humanoids and industrial AI. I think what's really interesting as well is when we just talked about Greenfield, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, especially as we see with the conflict in Iran. So all of the trends that we talked about, all of the forecasts we are making could change relatively quickly. So there's a lot of announcements that are still coming up. I think companies, they don't wait 1 year to come up with new products. It's going to be more continuous now, yeah.